The fiddle went silent the moment Monroe Townsend's hand reached for Emma Hawkins a fifth time. Every soul in the Dusty Creek Community Hall felt it, that sharp, breathless pause when the world teeters on the edge of something irreversible. The lantern light flickered as if the flames themselves were holding their breath. Men in their Sunday best and women in their finest calico stood frozen mid-conversation, punch cups raised halfway to lips that had stopped moving. Even old Hector Walsh, who was half-deaf from 20 years of blacksmithing, sensed that something monumental was happening in the center of that sawdust-covered floor. Emma's hand hovered in midair, trembling, and it was not from cold, because Monroe Townsend was not supposed to be here anymore. He was not supposed to be anything to her anymore. She had told him that clearly, with every ounce of dignity she could scrape together, 14 days ago on the steps of the post office. She had told him that what was between them was nothing but a foolish, dangerous mistake. She had told him she was leaving Dusty Creek, that she had already written to her cousin in Santa Fe, that the past they shared was a wound she had chosen to stop reopening. And he had stood there in the dust, badge gleaming on his chest, jaw hard as the granite bluffs above town, and he had said nothing. He had let her go, yet here he was, and here she was, and his hand was extended toward her with a patience and a certainty that made the whole room feel like it was tilting sideways. "Monroe," she said, and her voice came out wrong, too soft, too much like the woman she used to be before secrets and betrayal had turned everything inside out. "Emma," he said back, and just her name in his mouth undid 3 months of careful, deliberate forgetting. She stared at that outstretched hand, the calluses on his palm, the ink stain on his right index finger from the deputy's logbook, the faint scar along his wrist from the incident she had tried to stop thinking about, and every wall she had built in 14 days came crashing down in a single stuttering heartbeat. She took his hand. The fiddle started up again. The room exhaled. But nothing was the same as it had been before, and everyone present, in some private recess of their chest, understood that they were watching something unfold that had been a long time coming and would not be stopped by anything as small as pride or fear or the dark past that had driven these two people to the very edge of losing each other forever. But to understand why that moment cracked the room open like a thunderclap, you have to understand how Emma Hawkins came to be in Dusty Creek at all. You have to understand what she carried with her, what she was running from, and why Monroe Townsend, the man who had danced with her once, then twice, then 3 times, then 4, while every other man at the social had done his polite single turn and retreated to the whiskey table, became the only person in the Arizona territory who could reach the part of her she had buried deepest. The year was 1883, and Emma Hawkins arrived in Dusty Creek on the 14th of March aboard the Southern Pacific's twice-weekly freight and passenger coach, with a trunk, a hat box, 2 carpet bags, and a face that gave nothing away. She was 26 years old, with dark chestnut hair she wore in a practical knot at the back of her neck, and brown eyes the color of creek water after rain deep and still on the surface, with currents moving fast underneath. She was not beautiful in the showy, immediate way that made men tip their hats on reflex. She was beautiful in the way that crept up on you, the kind of beautiful that lodged itself in a man's mind at 2 o'clock in the morning and refused to leave. She had a teaching certificate from the Missouri State Normal School, a letter of reference from the Reverend Thomas Adley of Springfield, and a story she had rehearsed so many times she almost believed it herself. The truth, which she told to no one in those first weeks, was considerably more complicated. Emma had been engaged to be married in Springfield. His name was Gerald Calloway, and he was 29 years old, handsome, prosperous, and charming in a way that operated at a register just below what your instincts could consciously identify as dangerous. He was a banker's son with excellent manners and a secret relationship with the criminal infrastructure of the Missouri River bottoms that he had been extraordinarily careful to keep entirely separate from his respectable life. Emma had discovered the truth by accident, the way people usually discover the truths that destroy them. She had been looking for a book in his study and found instead a locked drawer that was only locked because Gerald had for once in his meticulous life forgotten to secure it. Inside was a ledger. Inside the ledger were names, dates, amounts, and transactions that documented, in precise and damning detail, a scheme of land fraud and cattle theft that had ruined 4 families in the county and sent 2 innocent men to prison. She had stood there in his study for 11 minutes, she had counted, because her mind, in moments of extreme shock, did strange things like count, and then she had closed the drawer, put the book she was looking for under her arm, gone back to the parlor and said nothing. For 3 weeks she had said nothing and done everything with careful, deliberate normalcy while she made a plan. Gerald Calloway had connections everywhere in Springfield. His father controlled the bank, which meant he controlled the mortgages, which meant he controlled most of the town's property holders in the quiet, invisible way that money always controls people who need it. Going to the local sheriff was not a safe option. Going to anyone in Springfield was not a safe option. Emma had no brothers, her father had died of fever when she was 16, and her mother had remarried a man in Kansas City who was a fine enough person but not equipped for this particular kind of trouble. So she had done what strong, practical, terrified women did in 1883. She had written to the Territorial School Board in Yavapai County, Arizona, where she knew there was a shortage of teachers, and she had gotten herself hired sight unseen based on her certificate and Reverend Adley's enthusiastic reference, and she had packed her trunk and her 2 carpet bags and her hat box, and she had left on a Tuesday morning when Gerald was at the bank, leaving behind only a brief letter that said she had reconsidered the engagement and wished him well and hoped he would understand. She had taken nothing that was his. She had left nothing behind that could be used against her. She had told herself she was starting fresh, and she had almost made herself believe it. Dusty Creek was a small but sturdy town of roughly 340 souls, built along a creek that ran fast in spring and slowed to a determined trickle by August, surrounded by red rock country that turned gold and copper at sunset in a way that had startled Emma into standing stock still on her first evening, suitcase in hand, staring west with her chest doing something she hadn't expected. The town had a general store run by the Pearson family, a livery stable, a barber, a hotel with 12 rooms, a saloon that observed a reasonable set of unspoken community boundaries, a church, a school that had been without a teacher for 4 months, and a marshal's office with a marshal and a deputy. The marshal was a 47-year-old man named Elias Croft, broad as a barn door, permanently sun-darkened, and possessed of an impressive mustache and a calm, deliberate way of moving through the world that made you understand immediately why people had voted for him. He was fair, methodical, and deeply invested in the peace of Dusty Creek. His deputy was Monroe Townsend. Emma met Monroe on her second day in town, before she had even begun to process her first day, which had involved unpacking in the schoolteacher's modest house behind the church, accepting a plate of food from her neighbor Mrs. Clara Fontaine, and falling asleep at 7:30 in the evening with her boots still on. She was at the general store, making a list of what she needed for the schoolroom, when the bell above the door rang and Monroe Townsend walked in. He was 28 years old, lean through the hips but broad through the shoulders, with light brown hair that had been lightened further by months of Arizona sun, and gray eyes the exact color of storm clouds rolling in from the west. He wore his deputy's badge, a clean shirt, and a pair of boots that had been recently polished, which told Emma, who was good at noticing things, that he was a man who took his appearance seriously without being vain about it. He had a direct way of moving, unhurried but purposeful, and when he spoke to Mr. Pearson at the counter, his voice was low and unhurried and easy. He noticed her because she was the only person in the store he didn't recognize. He introduced himself with a directness that Emma found simultaneously startling and refreshing after 3 weeks of performing careful, friendly invisibility. "Monroe Townsend," he said, "deputy here in Dusty Creek. You must be the new school teacher." "Emma Hawkins," she said. "I arrived yesterday. How are you finding it so far?" "I haven't formed a complete opinion yet," she said honestly. "I've mainly slept." Something flickered in his eyes, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "That's probably wise. The country takes some adjusting too." "I'm from Missouri," she said. "It's considerably flatter there." "It is," he agreed. He had apparently spent time in Missouri, because he elaborated briefly and specifically about the difference in land and light, and Emma found herself in an actual conversation that moved through 3 different topics in the space of 5 minutes in a way that felt natural and easy, which was unusual for her. She was ordinarily careful about conversation, treating it the way you treat unfamiliar terrain, testing each step before you commit your weight to it. With Monroe Townsend, she found herself committing weight without entirely meaning to. She left the general store with her supplies and a strange, warm unease that she attributed to the altitude and the dry air and the general disorientation of being somewhere entirely new. The weeks that followed were busy ones. Emma threw herself into the school with the focused energy of someone who needed to keep her hands and mind occupied at all hours, which was precisely what she needed. The children of Dusty Creek ranged in age from 6 to 15 and were, like children everywhere, a combination of extraordinary and exhausting. She had 17 students. She learned all their names in the first 2 days, and their particular talents and difficulties in the first 2 weeks, and by the end of the first month she had a genuine affection for most of them and a productive professional relationship with all of them. She also, in the course of the normal rhythms of small-town life, encountered Monroe Townsend with a frequency that she noticed, cataloged, and with great deliberateness declined to attach meaning to. He brought found items to her that belonged to her students: a hair ribbon, a slate pencil, a small carved wooden horse. He helped her with a dispute between 2 families over a property line that had crossed onto the schoolyard. He warned her about a section of the creek path that flooded dangerously in spring. He did none of these things with any obvious intent or pressure, and he never asked her personal questions beyond the ordinary getting-to-know-you variety, which meant there was nothing to deflect and nowhere to build a polite wall. It was deeply inconvenient. More inconvenient was the fact that she had begun to see him clearly, the way you see people when the initial performance of a new acquaintance settles and what's underneath becomes visible. What was underneath Monroe Townsend was, inconveniently, quite fine. He was honest without being blunt, perceptive without being intrusive, funny in a dry, understated way that caught you off guard, and possessed of a moral seriousness that was neither rigid nor preachy, but simply consistent. The kind that comes from having thought things through rather than having been told what to think. She found out, through the ordinary channels of small-town information, that he had grown up in Tucson, had served briefly as a Pinkerton agency operative after a stint in the U.S. Army, and had come to Dusty Creek 3 years ago when Marshal Croft offered him the deputy's position. She found out he was unmarried, that he had never been married, and that this was apparently a source of mild communal bewilderment, because several of the town's mothers had, over the years, introduced him to perfectly eligible daughters who had reported back that he was entirely pleasant and showed no particular interest. When Mrs. Clara Fontaine, who was Emma's primary source of local intelligence, shared this last piece of information with a significant look, Emma said, in a neutral tone and changed the subject. The Spring Social was an annual event in Dusty Creek, organized by the church ladies and held in the community hall on the last Saturday of April. It was a genuine occasion. People came from the surrounding ranches. The hall was decorated with paper flowers and ribbons. Someone always brought a spectacular cake, and the fiddle player, a rancher named Pete Dorsey who had surprising talent, played from 7 o'clock until 11. There was a punch table, a supper table, and a general expectation that everyone would dance with everyone at least once as a matter of community fellowship. Emma attended because not attending would have made her conspicuous in a way she was consciously avoiding, and because Clara had made her a new dress of pale green calico that fit beautifully, and which Emma could not in good conscience fail to wear. She arrived at 7:30 and was absorbed immediately into the warm, cheerful chaos of the hall. The decorations were generous and enthusiastic, if not perfectly executed. The fiddle music was lively, the punch was sweet and cold, and the atmosphere was one of genuine community pleasure, people who lived hard, isolated lives taking a sanctioned evening to be purely happy in each other's company. Emma danced first with Mr. Pearson from the general store, who was a competent if cautious dancer, and talked about his lumber delivery the entire time. She danced with Hector Walsh the blacksmith, who was better than you would expect a man of his size to be, and who made her laugh with a story about his youngest son's spectacular failure to catch a jackrabbit. She danced with Dr. Addison, who was 70 years old, and danced with the precise, formal correctness of a man who had learned in a drawing room. She danced with a young rancher named Thomas Birch, who was 19 and crimson with embarrassment from beginning to end. Each of these dances lasted exactly one song, and each of these men, having fulfilled their social obligation with grace and goodwill, escorted her politely back to the edge of the floor and rejoined their friends or their wives. Monroe Townsend appeared at her elbow at 8:15. "Would you care to dance?" he asked. She said yes because it would have been rude not to, and also, she admitted privately, because she wanted to. The fiddle was playing a waltz, and Monroe danced a waltz the way he did most things, with relaxed competence and no theatrics. He was a comfortable lead, not aggressive, not hesitant, just steady. They were an appropriate distance apart in the manner of the time and place, and he talked to her easily about the hall, about the cake, about the particular comedy of watching young Thomas Birch attempt to ask Miss Patterson to dance. Emma found herself laughing genuinely, and the dance ended, and he thanked her, and she thanked him, and he walked her back to the side of the room. And then, 12 minutes later, he was back. "Would you like to dance again?" he asked. She looked at him carefully. There was nothing in his expression that was pushy or presumptuous. He was simply asking. "All right," she said. The second dance was a real, faster, and more complicated, and they had to pay attention to the steps, and it was fun in a straightforward, unguarded way that she hadn't expected. When it ended, she was laughing, and so was he, and something in her chest had loosened slightly without her permission. He came back a third time, and then a fourth. By the fourth dance, Emma was aware that the hall had begun to pay attention. Not in an unkind way, more in the way that communities monitor interesting developments, with fond interest and no malice. She saw Clara Fontaine exchange a look with Mrs. Addison that communicated volumes without a syllable being spoken. She saw Mr. Pearson say something to his wife that made his wife smile. She was aware, suddenly and with uncomfortable clarity, that Monroe Townsend requesting dance after dance, while every other man had politely done one turn and moved on, was a statement that the entire room was reading. She was not sure what to do with that. After the fourth dance, when he had walked her back to the side of the room and was still standing beside her, not pressing for a fifth, just standing there in the easy, present way he had, she turned to look at him directly and said, "Every man at this social has danced with me once out of politeness." "I know," he said. "You've danced with me 4 times. I know that too." She studied him. He held her gaze without flinching, without performing anything, without making it bigger than it was or smaller than it was. Just looking back at her with those storm cloud eyes and the quiet patience of a man who had made a decision and was comfortable waiting to see how it landed. "Why?" she asked. The question was genuine. She was not fishing for a compliment. She needed to understand his motive the way she needed to understand all things directly, clearly, without ambiguity. He was quiet for a moment, which she had come to understand was his way, not an evasion but a genuine consideration. "Because the first one was politeness," he said. "And the second one was because I wanted to talk to you more. And the third one was because I wasn't ready to stop. And the fourth one was because I realized I should just be honest about what I was doing instead of pretending each one was going to be the last one." Emma Hawkins, who had survived Gerald Calloway and a cross-country flight and 3 months of careful self-containment, felt something shift in her chest with a force that genuinely frightened her. "Monroe," she said, and her voice came out careful and deliberate, "I am not in a position to be pursuing anything with anyone right now." "I'm not asking you to be," he said. "I mean it." "I believe you," he said, and his tone was entirely sincere. "I'm not asking for anything, Emma. I just wanted to be honest instead of pretending I didn't enjoy dancing with you. You can tell me to go stand by the punch table and I'll go do that." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not telling you to go stand by the punch table," she said. "All right," he said. "But I need you to understand that I can't, I understand," he said. "We don't need to make it more complicated than it is right now," she exhaled. "Then could we maybe just get some of that punch?" They got punch. They stood by the window and talked for 45 minutes about books, about teaching, about the difference between Tucson and Dusty Creek, about a territorial bill that was going before the legislature, about the quality of the cake, which was exceptional. And when the fiddle started up a fifth waltz and he turned and raised an eyebrow at her, she put down her punch cup and held out her hand. That fifth dance was the one that went quiet in the room. That was the one that made the whole hall hold its breath. And that was the one where Emma Hawkins, halfway through the song, with Monroe Townsend's hand steady at her waist, and the lantern light warm and the fiddle song sweet and low, felt the cold, careful wall she had been building around herself for months develop a crack that she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, was never going to be fully repaired. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her small house behind the church and stared at the ceiling, and had a conversation with herself that was completely honest, which was the kind of conversation she only allowed herself in the absolute dark, when there was no one to perform anything for. She acknowledged that she was in danger of developing real feelings for Monroe Townsend. She acknowledged that this was dangerous for reasons that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with Gerald Calloway. She acknowledged that if Gerald Calloway ever found her, and she did not know whether he was looking, but she thought he might be, because she was a loose end, and Gerald Calloway was a man who did not like loose ends, then anyone she had drawn close to her in Dusty Creek would be in danger. She also acknowledged, with a quiet, unhappy honesty, that the reason the wall had cracked was not just because Monroe Townsend was kind and interesting and danced well. It was because he had looked at her and seen her, not the composed, careful performance she put on, but something underneath it, and he hadn't made a large production of that seeing, hadn't tried to use it or press it, had just acknowledged it simply and given her the space to respond to it or not. She resolved to be more careful. She resolved to maintain appropriate distance. She resolved to be polite and pleasant and entirely professional. She was moderately successful at this for about 3 weeks. It was the Creek incident that undid her moderate success, and it happened on a Wednesday in early May, which was the kind of specific day that becomes permanent in memory because of what occurs on it. Emma had taken her older students on a nature walk along the creek path as part of a geography lesson, 8 children between the ages of 10 and 14, in the middle of a warm afternoon. They were examining rock formations and sketching in their notebooks, which was going well, when the sky that had been clear all morning turned a particular shade of greenish yellow that the desert does sometimes, very quickly, without warning. Emma had grown up in Missouri and knew what that color meant. "Everyone up from the bank," she said, keeping her voice calm and directing them firmly up toward the higher ground of the main path. They moved quickly, because her tone communicated the seriousness without inducing panic, which was one of her better skills. They were all on the upper path when the wall of water came down the creek, not a massive flood, but a fast, sudden rush of runoff from the higher country to the west that turned the dry season trickle into a churning 4-foot surge in under 2 minutes. One of her students, a 12-year-old boy named Will Fontaine, Clara's son, which would become relevant to the town's retelling of the story, had left his notebook down on a flat rock at the bank to go look at something further upstream. And when the water came, he went back for it reflexively, and Emma went after him without thinking, because she was 26 years old and a teacher, and Will Fontaine was 12 and her responsibility. She reached him before the main surge hit and got him back up the bank with about 4 seconds to spare. But in doing so, she slipped on the wet clay and went down hard on her left knee and side, and the edge of the surge caught her enough to half-soak her completely and deposit her, muddy and wet and limping, on the upper path with 8 wide-eyed children staring at her. Monroe was riding the creek path on a routine patrol and arrived 6 minutes later to find Emma Hawkins standing with 8 children, soaking wet, mud on her face, and a rapidly swelling left knee, delivering what appeared to be a calm and detailed lesson on the geological factors that create flash flooding. He helped her home after entrusting the children to an older student. He helped her with her knee, which needed cleaning and binding, and he did this with matter-of-fact efficiency that did not make her feel helpless or pitied. He made tea from her stove and sat across from her while she drank it and finally let herself come down from the adrenaline. "That was a brave thing you did," he said. "It was a thoughtless thing," she said, which was what she believed. "I shouldn't have let Will get so far ahead." "You got him out, by the narrowest possible margin." He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite categorize, not pity, something softer and more specific. "Are you always this hard on yourself?" he asked. She considered. "Yes," she said. "About everything or just work?" She wrapped her hands around her teacup and did not answer for a moment. "I've made some mistakes in my life that were considerably more significant than letting a 12-year-old get too close to a creek bank," she said carefully. "They recalibrate things." "What kind of mistakes?" he asked, and his tone was entirely gentle, no pressure in it. She almost told him. She was astonished to find herself almost telling him, sitting in her small kitchen with wet hair and a bandaged knee, almost telling Monroe Townsend about Gerald Calloway and the locked drawer and the ledger that had ended her previous life. She caught herself. "The kind you don't discuss on short acquaintance," she said, with a small, apologetic smile to take the sting out of it. "Fair enough," he said, and let it go completely, and she found that the fact that he let it go made her feel worse about not telling him, not better, which made no sense at all. He visited to check on her knee the next day, professionally and briefly. The day after that, he stopped by with a book she had mentioned wanting to read, which he had borrowed from the doctor, who had an impressive library. The day after that she was back in school and they were back to the ordinary rhythms of small-town proximity, and nothing was said and nothing was declared and nothing explicit had changed. But something had shifted irrevocably in the territory between them, and they both knew it. June came in hot and dry, the way Arizona summer begins its long advance, and Emma Hawkins found herself doing something she had not done since her first week in Dusty Creek. She stopped being primarily occupied with the past and started being, for hours at a time, fully present in the place and the life she had made here. She found herself making plans for the fall school term, for a garden plot behind her house, for a reading group she wanted to start for the town's adults. She found herself, on certain evenings, walking out to the flat rock above town where you could see the whole red country spread out to the south. And sometimes Monroe was there too, not by arrangement, but because they had both independently discovered it as a thinking place. And they would sit on separate rocks and talk as the light went from gold to copper to deep violet. And those conversations were the kind that go deep without fanfare. The kind that build something real without either person formally acknowledging that something is being built. She told him about her father, who had been a school principal, and had taught her that the most important thing you could pass on to a student was the ability to think critically. He told her about his mother, who had died of pneumonia when he was 15 and whose absence he had carried into his adult life as a permanent, quiet ache. She told him about teaching in Springfield, carefully, the version of Springfield that didn't include Gerald Calloway. He told her about his time in the Pinkerton agency, the cases that were interesting, the ones that had stayed with him, and why he had eventually found the work incompatible with his conscience. "Because the Pinkertons are hired by whoever can pay," he said one evening, watching the last light drain out of the western sky. "Sometimes who can pay is who's right, and sometimes it's just who has money. That started to bother me more than I could manage." Emma looked at him. "Most people manage it fine," she said. "The bothering. Most people learn to separate what they do from what they believe," he said. "I seem to be constitutionally unable to do that." She was quiet for a moment. "That's both admirable and probably inconvenient," she said. "Extremely," he agreed and smiled. And Emma Hawkins looked at that smile in the last light of a June evening and knew, with the same quiet, devastating certainty she had been resisting for weeks, that she was in love with Monroe Townsend. The knowledge sat in her chest like a coal, warm and uncomfortable and permanent. She did not sleep well that night either. The trouble arrived on a Saturday in July, on the afternoon stage from Tucson. Emma was in the general store when she heard the stage horn, which was normal, and she paid it no particular attention while she finished her purchases. It was only when she stepped out onto the boardwalk and saw the man climbing down from the stage that the world contracted to a bright, cold point. He was 30 years old, well-dressed, carrying a leather traveling bag, and looking around Dusty Creek with the alert, assessing gaze of a man who had been looking for something for a while and thought he had finally found it. Gerald Calloway. Emma turned immediately and went back inside the store, moving quickly to the far back corner near the dry goods shelves, where the window faced the alley instead of the street. Her heart was knocking against her ribs with a force that was almost painful, and her mind was running very fast in the focused, crisis-oriented way it did when things were genuinely dangerous. He had found her. She didn't know how. Perhaps the school board had records, perhaps he had contacts in territorial administration, perhaps he was simply resourceful, which she had always known him to be. The how was less important than the fact. He was here. She needed to think. If she ran, she would lose everything she had built. The school, her house, her students, the community that had become, without her fully intending it, the first real home she had had in years. She would be starting over again, and Gerald would simply follow her again. If she stayed and tried to handle it, quietly tried to convince him to leave, tried to appeal to whatever version of reason still operated in him, she would be exposed, and she would be alone in the exposure, and that felt like walking into a trap. There was a third option, and it had a face and gray eyes and a deputy's badge, and the thought of involving Monroe in this, in the particular kind of danger that came with Gerald Calloway's dark connections, made her feel sick with a dread that was entirely about him and not at all about herself. She stayed in the back of the store for 20 minutes, which was long enough for Gerald to have retrieved his bag, spoken to someone, and presumably been directed to the hotel. Then she went out the alley door and took the back way home. She sat in her kitchen for an hour. Then she got up, put on her hat in her most composed expression, and walked to the marshal's office. Monroe was there alone, working at the deputy's logbook, and he looked up when she came in with the particular attentiveness he always gave her, which was quick and real and which now, under these circumstances, felt like both an anchor and a weight. "Emma," he said, reading something in her face immediately. He stood. "What's wrong?" She sat down in the chair across from his desk and laced her fingers together in her lap and told him. All of it. Gerald Calloway, the engagement, the locked drawer, the ledger, the flight from Springfield, the false story about simply wanting a new start. She told him with the same focused, factual delivery she used in the classroom, not because she wasn't frightened, but because the truth needed to be clear. Monroe listened without interrupting. His face went through several things: surprise, concern, a brief flash of something harder that might have been controlled anger, but he did not react in the ways she had half expected and feared. He did not look at her with recrimination for the deception. He did not look at her with pity. He looked at her with the same clear, direct regard he had always given her, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, the way he always was before he said something meaningful. "The ledger," he said. "You saw it yourself. Could you describe what it documented well enough to be useful to federal authorities?" She blinked. That was not the first question she had expected. "Yes," she said slowly. It was detailed. Names, dates, amounts. The land fraud was against 4 specific parcels in Crawford County. 2 men were convicted. Their names were Absalom Tate and James Riordan. Monroe was nodding slowly. "Then what you have is not just a reason to run, it's a case." "Gerald Calloway has half of Springfield in his pocket," she said. "His father controls the bank." "Springfield is not the only jurisdiction," Monroe said. He leaned forward slightly. "The U.S. Marshal for the Western District operates out of Tucson. I know Frank Aldridge personally. He was Pinkerton before I was. He's not in anyone's pocket. Land fraud of this scale is a federal matter, Emma." "It should have been a federal matter from the start." Emma sat very still. The idea of going on offense rather than defense was one she had not let herself fully consider, because the alternative, hiding, running, managing quietly, had always felt safer. But sitting here now, with Gerald Calloway installed at the Dusty Creek Hotel 3 blocks away, she understood with sudden clarity that safe was relative, and that she had been so focused on not provoking danger that she had failed to notice she had been living inside it the entire time. "He's going to approach me," she said. "He's not here for a scenery tour." "I know," Monroe said, "and when he does I want to be somewhere nearby." "Monroe," she stopped. The dread was back, sharp and specific. "I don't want you in danger because of me." He met her eyes. "I'm the deputy here. Managing threats to people in this town is my job. This is not Dusty Creek trouble. This is my trouble that I brought here." "You live here," he said simply and firmly. "That makes it Dusty Creek's trouble." She looked at him for a long moment, and the coal in her chest that she had been trying to manage since June burned a little brighter, and she hated it and needed it in equal measure. "All right," she said. Gerald came to the school on Monday morning. He had spent Sunday, she learned later from the hotel's owner, asking careful questions about her position, her standing in the community, whether she was well-liked, whether she had close friends, all of which were the questions of a man building a dossier rather than renewing an acquaintance. He arrived at the schoolhouse door at 8:30, before classes started, in a good suit and with the same handsome, confident smile she had once found reassuring. Emma was at her desk. She had been expecting him. She had spent Sunday night preparing. The way you prepare for something you know is coming, not with fear, but with a focused, cold clarity that had its own kind of strength. "Emma," he said, "you're looking well. The desert air seems to agree with you." "Gerald," she said. She did not stand. She had chosen not to stand because the small choices of posture and space mattered, and she needed him to understand from the first moment that she was not the same woman who had left Springfield in quiet, dignified terror. "I've been looking for you for quite a while," he said, coming into the room and sitting in a student's chair as if she had invited him to, which she had not. "I think you know why." "I think I know why you think you're here," she said, "and I want to be clear about something before we have any further conversation. I know what was in that drawer, Gerald. I knew when I left Springfield, and I have been in correspondence with the U.S. Marshal's office in Tucson." The smile didn't change on the surface, but something behind his eyes shifted, a slight cooling, a recalculation. "That's a significant claim," he said carefully. "It is," she agreed. "The names Absalom Tate and James Riordan, Crawford County land fraud, 1881 and 1882, federal jurisdiction. I can be detailed about dates and amounts because I spent 11 minutes looking at your ledger, and I have an extremely accurate memory. Emma." His voice had gone careful and soft. the way she remembered it going before he said something that was designed to sound reasonable while being something else entirely. I think there are ways we can resolve this situation that are good for both of us. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I care about you and I want to understand. Monroe, she said, and he came in through the back door of the schoolroom because that had been the arrangement, and the sight of the deputy's badge and the particular quality of Monroe Townsend's stillness when he was being professionally alert stopped Gerald Calloway's carefully prepared speech at its exact midpoint. The two men regarded each other. "Gerald Calloway," Monroe said, in the tone he apparently reserved for men he was professionally assessing. "I'm Deputy Monroe Townsend. I'd like you to come with me to the marshal's office so we can have a conversation about your presence in Dusty Creek." Gerald looked from Monroe to Emma and back, and Emma saw him calculating, weighing the ledger, her testimony, the badge, the federal correspondence she had referenced, the entirety of the situation, and she watched the calculation conclude somewhere he had not expected to arrive. "I'll be leaving town this afternoon," Gerald said carefully. "I appreciate that," Monroe said, "and I'm still going to need you to come to the office first." Gerald went. He had, it transpired, brought a companion from Springfield, a man who had been introduced as his business associate and who had been watching Emma's movements, which Monroe had already noted and was prepared for. Both men left Dusty Creek on the Tuesday morning stage, but the real work had already been done before they arrived. Monroe had written to Frank Aldridge in Tucson on the Sunday evening, after Emma left his office, with a detailed account of what she had described. Aldridge, who had been building a case against corrupt banking interests in Missouri through an entirely different angle, responded within 10 days with a letter that made Emma's specific testimony valuable beyond what she had imagined. The case against Gerald Calloway and his network became, over the following 6 months, a federal prosecution that did not require Emma to return to Springfield or put herself in any direct danger. 2 of the wrongfully convicted men were eventually released. Their cases were reviewed and overturned. Emma would not learn the full outcome for months, but when she did, she sat in her kitchen on a November evening and cried quietly for about 10 minutes, which was not something she often allowed herself, but which she felt was appropriate to the occasion. But between July and November, a great many other things happened, and they mattered considerably. The week after Gerald Calloway left Dusty Creek, Emma went to Monroe. She found him at the Evening Flat Rock, which had become, over the summer, something close to their place, not formally designated, not discussed, but understood in the way that certain spaces between two people acquire meaning through accumulated presence. The sun was going down and the sky was deep gold, and Coral and Monroe was sitting with his knees up, looking south, and he heard her coming and turned, and she sat down on the rock beside him, not her separate rock this time, the same one, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Thank you," she said, "for Sunday, for the letter to Aldridge, for being there in the schoolroom." "Emma, no, let me finish. I need to say this." She turned to look at him. "I came to you because I didn't have anyone else I could trust with this. And I want you to know that I understand the risk you took on my behalf, and it was not I did not take it for granted. And I want to apologize for the fact that I wasn't honest with you from the beginning, because I should have been, and the reason I wasn't was fear." "And Emma," he said, and his voice was quiet and direct. "Stop." She stopped. "I don't need an apology," he said. "You had very good reasons for being careful. You were protecting yourself, which was exactly the right thing to do." "It was deception," she said. "It was survival," he said. "I've seen enough of how people behave under genuine threat to know the difference." She was quiet for a moment. The last edge of the sun slid below the horizon. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "The dances," she said, "at the social. Everyone else danced once. You kept coming back. You knew from the first one, I think." He was quiet for a moment in his considering way. "I knew something," he said. "I knew I wanted more than one dance. I knew that was significant. Were you not afraid of that?" He turned to look at her. "A little," he said honestly. but I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let fear of something real make me act like nothing was happening. Emma Hawkins looked at Monroe Townsend in the deepening dark of an Arizona July evening and understood clearly and completely that the wall she had built was not just cracked anymore. It was gone. It had been gone for a while. She had simply been standing in its footprint, pretending there was still something there. "I'm in love with you," she said, because she was a person who valued directness and honesty above almost everything else, and she was done performing otherwise. "I have been for a while. I wanted you to know." Monroe Townsend looked at her with those storm cloud eyes that held something warm and certain and clear as anything she had ever seen. And he said, "I've been in love with you since approximately the second Tuesday of your first month here, when you walked into the store and said you hadn't formed a complete opinion yet because you'd mainly slept." Emma laughed, a real laugh, not performed, not careful, just real. "That's a very specific memory," she said. "You're a very specific person," he said. "That's one of the things." She leaned against him, a small, deliberate movement, and he put his arm around her. And they sat together on the flat rock in the warm dark while the desert stars came out overhead in their extraordinary, undimmed Arizona multitudes. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Emma Hawkins was simply, completely, unguardedly present in her own life. The months that followed were the happiest, most terrifying, most vivid and alive months Emma had lived. Terrifying because love, real love, the kind that rearranges your understanding of your own future, is always frightening no matter how good it is. And Emma had spent enough time running from things to know that the things worth being frightened of were not the obvious threats but the quiet ones, the ones that meant something permanent and real. Monroe courted her with the same directness and patience he applied to everything. There were no dramatic gestures, no performances. He showed up on Sunday afternoons with a picnic basket from the hotel kitchen, and they rode out to the canyon and ate and talked and laughed. He wrote her notes, not love letters precisely, but letters that were both specific and warm, about things they had discussed or things he had read that he thought would interest her, with a line or two at the end that were more personal, and which she kept in the small tin box in her bedroom where she kept the things she did not want to lose. He introduced her formally to Marshall Croft, who had already figured out what was happening and who said, with the comfortable bluntness of a man who spent no energy on social pretense, "About time." He brought her to meet his closest friend in the county, a rancher named Sam Dalton who had a homestead 12 miles north and who treated Emma with the straightforward warmth of someone who trusted Monroe's judgment and had decided that anyone he valued was worth valuing. Emma, for her part, stopped managing herself. She had spent so long performing composure and distance and fine that simply being, simply allowing herself to feel what she felt, want what she wanted, need what she needed was both a relief and a revelation. She found herself talking to Monroe with a directness and a depth that she had not allowed herself with anyone since before Gerald Calloway, since perhaps ever, and she found that the depth was not dangerous but sustaining. That being fully known was not a vulnerability but a foundation. They had disagreements because they were two people with strong minds and independent views, and they disagreed the way adults disagree. Specifically, honestly, without cruelty, and with a willingness to be wrong that Emma found in Monroe more developed than in any person she had previously known well. He was not afraid to say he had been mistaken. He was not afraid to change his position when he encountered a better argument. This, she thought, was rarer than it should be. She also met the town differently now that she was meeting it as herself rather than as a careful performance. The people of Dusty Creek, the Pearsons, the Fontaines, Dr. Addison, Hector Walsh, Pete Dorsey with his fiddle, young Thomas Birch, who had blushed through their social dance and grown at least 2 inches since May became real to her in a way they had not quite been when she was holding herself slightly apart from everything. The town held her, she found. It held her in the ordinary, powerful way that communities hold people, through small kindnesses and shared history, and the accumulated weight of having been witnessed. In September, Monroe asked Marshall Croft about the process for requesting a long-term assignment in Dusty Creek rather than remaining indefinitely on a provisional arrangement, which was apparently a technicality that had never been formally addressed. Croft looked at him for a moment and then said, with the air of a man who was going to let one entirely irrelevant piece of procedural information remain unspoken, that there was no rush but that it might be worth formalizing. Monroe came home from that conversation and told Emma, who understood what was underneath it, and they sat on her porch in the early autumn evening and let the implication sit between them comfortably without having to do anything about it quite yet. In October, a letter arrived from Frank Aldridge in Tucson with an update on the Calloway case, and it was the best kind of update. The case was proceeding. The evidence Emma had provided had been corroborating rather than primary, which meant her formal testimony might not be required, and several additional witnesses had come forward. Emma read the letter twice and then folded it and sat quietly for a while with the particular piece of someone who has put down something heavy they've been carrying for a very long time. She wrote back to Aldridge with additional details she remembered, and she wrote separately to the county clerk in Crawford County, Missouri, explaining what she knew about the Tate and Riordan convictions and providing her contact address for any formal proceedings that might require her participation. She did this because it was right and because she had chosen, somewhere between Gerald Calloway's departure and the flat rock under the July stars, to stop running from her past and start standing in her present. Monroe read the letters before she sent them, not because she needed his approval, but because she wanted him to know everything, and he was, by October, the person she thought out loud with. The second social of the year was not the formal spring social, but a smaller harvest gathering in mid-October, which the church organized to celebrate the end of the growing season and to bring the outlying ranchers into town before winter made travel difficult. It was a warm, informal evening, more crowded than the spring social, with several people Emma had not met before, ranch families who lived too far out to come to town regularly. A group of men from the silver mine, 40 miles northeast, who had come in for supplies and stayed for the party. Emma arrived with Clara Fontaine, who had become her closest friend in Dusty Creek, and she found Monroe at the supper table where he had been helping arrange chairs, because someone had asked him to, and he was incapable of being in a room where something needed doing and not doing it. She came up beside him and he turned, and the look on his face, warm and immediate and entirely unguarded, was one she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. They danced together that night without any pretense about politeness. They danced first because they wanted to, and then because the music was good and the evening was warm and there was nothing left to pretend. Between dances, they talked with Sam Dalton and his wife Ruth, who had come in from the North Ranch, and with the Fontaines, and with young Thomas Birch, who had asked Miss Patterson to dance, and she had said yes, which had clearly transformed his entire experience of his own capabilities. Emma watched him cross the floor with his chin up and thought about how courage accretes, how each small act of it makes the next one a little more possible. She thought about herself, a year ago, on a Tuesday morning in Springfield with a train ticket and a story she barely believed, and she thought about herself now, standing in a community hall in Arizona Territory with Monroe's hand at the small of her back and 30 people who knew her real name and real history and genuinely liked her anyway, and she thought that the distance between those two moments was not a year. It was something more fundamental. It was the distance between hiding and being found. Not found by Gerald Calloway. Found by herself. The harvest gathering ended at 10 o'clock, and Monroe walked Emma home under a fat October moon that turned the Red Rock country silver, and they stood on her porch for a while in the comfortable way they stood on each other's porches now, which was to say for much longer than was strictly necessary. "Emma," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't asked yet," he pointed out. "You were about to," she said. He laughed, the low, easy laugh she loved. "Were you going to let me?" "Yes," she said. "I just wanted you to know that I already know what my answer is." He turned to face her fully in the moonlight, and he was serious in the way he was when something mattered, which was not solemn but just true. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to build something with you in this place, and I want to do it honestly and completely and for the rest of my life. And I want you to know that I'm not asking because of anything I think you need or anything I think I'm offering that you couldn't manage without. I'm asking because you are the person I want to be with, and I would like to have the formal right to tell people that." Emma Hawkins looked at Monroe Townsend in the October moonlight and felt, deeply and cleanly and without any reservation, that this was the exact right thing happening at the exact right time in exactly the right place. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He kissed her then, properly and finally, and it was absolutely worth everything that had come before it. They were married in the Dusty Creek Church on the 15th of December, 1883, on a Saturday that was cold by Arizona standards, meaning the temperature had dropped enough that women wore their wool shawls and the horse's breath made clouds in the air. The church was full because Dusty Creek was the kind of community that showed up for things, and Emma stood at the front in a dress of deep blue wool that Clara Fontaine had sewn for her, with Monroe in a suit that he had traveled to Tucson to acquire, and Reverend Holt read the service in a voice that filled the church completely. Emma made her vows in a clear, steady voice, looking at Monroe's face, and felt them settle into her like something being formally ratified that had already been true for months. Monroe made his vows in the same low, unhurried voice he used for everything that mattered, with his eyes on her face and a stillness about him that communicated, to everyone in the room who was paying attention, that this was a man making a commitment with his whole self and no reservations. Sam and Ruth Dalton hosted the wedding dinner at their ranch house, which was large enough, and Pete Dorsey played fiddle, and Clara cried, and Hector Walsh made a toast in his booming blacksmith's voice that was both loud and unexpectedly moving, and Monroe danced with Emma every dance except the one he danced with Mrs. Fontaine, who was 70 years old and had requested it specifically. The winter that followed was quieter, the way first winters in marriages often are: a settling in, a learning of rhythms, an adjustment to the daily reality of building a shared life. Monroe continued as deputy, and Emma continued teaching, and they inhabited their days with the particular richness of two people who have been paying close attention to their own lives and who know, with a bone-deep certainty that requires no performance, that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. In January, letters arrived from Missouri. One was from the U.S. Marshal's office confirming that Gerald Calloway had been indicted on multiple counts of land fraud and financial deception, and that Emma's testimony, submitted in written form, had been accepted and would be sufficient without her physical return to Missouri. One was from a lawyer representing the families of Absalom Tate and James Riordan, the wrongfully convicted men, informing her that her evidence had been instrumental in the appeal of their convictions, and that both men were expected to be released by spring. Emma read both letters at the kitchen table while Monroe made coffee, and when she finished she was quiet for a long moment. "Good news?" Monroe asked, setting a cup in front of her. "The best kind," she said, "the kind where the right thing actually happens." He sat across from her and read both letters while she drank her coffee, and when he finished he looked up at her with an expression of quiet, serious satisfaction that she recognized as the one he wore when something had concluded the way justice intended. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she said. "You wrote to Aldridge. That started it." "You had the courage to tell the truth about what you'd seen," he said. "That was the thing." She thought about the woman in Gerald Calloway's study, standing for 11 minutes with a ledger that could destroy everything, and the woman who had fled on a Tuesday morning with 2 carpet bags and a story she barely believed, And the woman sitting here now in a warm kitchen in December territory with a deputy husband and a community and a life that was entirely and completely her own. I was very frightened, she said. I know, he said. That's what makes it courage. Spring came back to Dusty Creek in March. The way Arizona spring comes, suddenly, explosively, as if the desert had been storing all its color through the winter and released it all at once. The wildflowers appeared along the creek path, and the red rock warmed and the days stretched, and the quality of light changed to something golden and immediate that made every ordinary thing look slightly more itself. Emma discovered on a morning in late March that she was expecting. She told Monroe that evening, sitting on the porch, which had become, through the autumn and winter, the place they talked about the things that mattered. She told him simply and directly in her way, and watched his face change through something private and enormous, and when he reached for her hand, it was with a tenderness so careful and complete that she understood in that moment the full weight of what they had built together. A boy or a girl, he said, which was less a question and more a statement of ongoing wonder. We'll see, she said. Either way, he said, this child is going to have the most organized schoolteacher mother in the Arizona territory. And the most patient deputy father, she said. He laughed and she laughed, and the evening settled around them, warm and full of promise. The summer of 1884 was a productive and eventful one. Emma continued teaching until the end of the school year in May, and then she spent the summer doing lighter work preparing lesson materials, helping Clara with the reading group she had finally started, visiting with the ranch wives who came to town on market days, and who had become, over the past year, a genuine community of friendship. Monroe's work kept him busy in the ordinary rhythms of territorial law property disputes, the occasional disruption from the mine workers, a complicated issue with a horse thief that took 3 weeks to resolve but concluded without violence, which Monroe considered the ideal outcome of most situations. In August, Marshall Croft told Monroe he was planning to retire within the year and that he intended to recommend Monroe as his replacement, pending the formal vote of the town council. Monroe came home that evening and told Emma, and she sat across from him and watched him process it, the responsibility, the meaning, the fact that this was the place and the role he had without fully planning it made his own. What do you want? She asked, because that was always the first question. I want to stay here, he said. I want to keep doing this work in this place with these people. He looked at her. I want to do it as marshal if they'll have me. They'll have you, she said. You don't know that. Monroe, she said with a small smile, I know this town. I have spent 18 months talking to every person in it. They will have you. She was right. The town council voted in September, and the vote was unanimous. And on the 1st of October, 1884, Monroe Townsend was sworn in as Marshal of Dusty Creek, with Elias Croft standing beside him looking both proud and relieved, and Emma standing in the front of the small audience with her hands folded and her chin slightly lifted, and a feeling in her chest that was too large and too specific to have any name except love. The baby arrived on the 4th of November, 1884, in the early morning hours, with Clara Fontaine and Dr. Addison in attendance and Monroe present in the way that husbands were generally expected not to be present in 1884, which is to say, in the room, refusing to leave, holding Emma's hand until she told him to please stop wincing every time she did, which was not useful. It was a boy. They named him James, for the wrongfully convicted man whose freedom Emma's testimony had helped restore, and also because Monroe had a grandfather named James whom he had loved. James Townsend arrived in the world with a full head of dark hair like his mother's, and a look on his face that could only be described as thoughtful, which made Monroe laugh through the kind of emotions that don't have proper words for them, and which made Emma look down at this small, complete person on her chest and feel a love so specific and so total that it rearranged everything she thought she understood about the capacity of the human heart. She lay in the warm bedroom with the early November morning coming gray through the window, and Monroe beside her on the edge of the bed holding James with the focused, careful intensity of a man who has held a great many things in his life, and understood that this was incomparably the most important of them. And she thought about Tuesday mornings and train tickets and the long distance between fear and home. The winter was a full one. James was a good baby in the sense that he had strong opinions and expressed them clearly, which Emma found both challenging and philosophically consistent with her preferred approach to people. Monroe adapted to fatherhood with the same unhurried, attentive quality he brought to everything, and the sight of him walking the length of the kitchen with James against his shoulder at 2 in the morning, humming something low and formless, was one that Emma filed away permanently in the part of herself that kept the things too important to lose. The town treated James Townsend as a communal achievement, which was the way small towns treated babies, as confirmation that the future was viable, that the project of being a community together was worth continuing. Clara knitted an extraordinary quantity of small garments. Hector Walsh made a cradle of such solid craftsmanship that Monroe said it would probably last 3 generations, which made Emma smile in a way that implied she was thinking about what 3 generations meant and who would be in them. In the spring of 1885, a letter arrived that Emma had not been expecting. It was from Absalom Tate, one of the men whose conviction had been overturned, written in a hand that was not practiced but was completely sincere, thanking her for her courage and her testimony and the willingness to speak the truth at personal cost. He told her that he was home in Crawford County, that his farm was still standing because his wife had held it, that his children were well, that he had not been able to find the right words for some time but wanted her to know that what she had done mattered in the most fundamental possible way. It had given him back his life. Emma read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and wrote back with a care and a thoroughness that took most of the afternoon, because this was a correspondence that deserved to be done properly. She told Absalom Tate that she was glad he was home. She told him about Dusty Creek, about her teaching, about her marriage to Monroe, about James. She told him that the act of telling the truth about what she had seen had given her back something too, not a life exactly, because she had always had one, but the full ability to live it, which is a different and more important thing. She signed it Emma Townsend and sealed it, and gave it to Monroe to post on his morning rounds, and the name on the envelope. Emma Townsend was so entirely right that she stood for a moment after he left, just holding the feeling of it. The spring social of 1885 was the first that Emma attended as Marshall Townsend's wife, which was a subtle but meaningful shift in the community's understanding of her place in Dusty Creek. James was 7 months old and being managed admirably at home by Ruth Dalton, who had offered with the cheerful confidence of a woman who had raised 4 children and could handle anything. The hall was decorated again in paper flowers and ribbons. Pete Dorsey was at his fiddle again, and the punch was cold and sweet as it always was, and Emma walked into the hall on Monroe's arm and felt the warmth of 2 years of accumulated belonging settle around her shoulders like something earned and permanent. The social proceeded with its familiar rhythms. Monroe danced with Clara Fontaine as she had requested again. He danced with Mrs. Pearson, who appreciated the gesture. He danced with Ruth Dalton when Sam brought her in later. And he danced with Emma not once, not out of politeness, not with any pretense of social obligation. He danced with her because he wanted to, because the fiddle was playing something slow, and the lanterns were warm and she was in his arms. And in the year 1885 in the community hall of Dusty Creek, Arizona Territory, that was exactly where both of them wanted to be. They danced 3 dances together without stopping, and somewhere in the second one Emma pressed her forehead briefly against his jaw and felt him tighten his arm around her, and the music played and the lanterns flickered, and the room moved around them with the ordinary, extraordinary life of a community in full possession of itself. "You know," she said, close to his ear, "the first time we did this, every man at this social danced with me once out of politeness. And I kept coming back," he said. "You did," she said. "Why was that again? I've forgotten." "No, you haven't," he said. She smiled against his shoulder. "No," she said, "I haven't." They stayed until the end of the social, until Pete Dorsey played the last song, and the lanterns were trimmed, and Clara helped stack the chairs, and Hector Walsh boomed something cheerful into the night air, as the crowd dispersed into the cool spring dark. Monroe helped carry chairs because he could not be in a room where something needed doing, and Emma helped Clara roll up the paper flower garlands for next year, and they walked home together under the Arizona stars that were so thick and clear and bright that you could almost believe the sky was made of them. James was deeply asleep when they got home, perfect and warm in Hector Walsh's indestructible cradle, and Monroe stood in the doorway for a moment just watching him, and Emma stood beside Monroe, and neither of them said anything because everything was already said. In the years that followed, Monroe served as marshal of Dusty Creek with the same steady, honest, patient competence that had made him the obvious choice. He was not the most aggressive marshal the territory had seen, nor the fastest with a gun, though he was capable when capability was required. He was, people said when they talked about him, fair. He was the most consistently fair man they had known in a position of authority, which was not a small thing in the Arizona territory of the 1880s, and which mattered in ways both visible and invisible to the health of Dusty Creek as a community. Emma taught school until James was old enough to need her home, and then she shifted, not away from teaching entirely, but toward the reading group and the library she had established in a small room off the church hall, and the work she did informally with new families arriving in town, helping them navigate the practical business of establishing themselves. She was, in her own way, a kind of institutional memory for Dusty Creek, the woman who knew where everything was and how everything worked, and who was connected to whom, who could help you find a midwife or a contract lawyer or a good price on winter feed, who was simultaneously the most efficient person in the room and the most genuinely interested in you specifically. Clara Fontaine said, at one of the reading group evenings in 1887, that Emma Hawkins Townsend had arrived in Dusty Creek looking like a woman who had packed herself extremely carefully and intended to come undone for no one, and had proceeded to come undone in the best possible way, and in doing so had become the most essential person in the town, which was a tribute delivered with such sincere inelegance that Emma was laughing before it was finished. "That is," she said, "probably the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about me." Their second child arrived in the spring of 1887, a girl they named Clara Ruth, for two women who had held Emma in the first and hardest years, and Clara Fontaine cried with a thoroughness at the announcement that was both embarrassing and very touching. Clara Ruth had Monroe's gray eyes and Emma's dark hair, and from approximately the age of 2 weeks demonstrated a stubbornness that both her parents recognized immediately and found both exasperating and deeply familiar. "She is entirely you," Monroe told Emma one evening, watching their daughter refuse with absolute determination to eat something she had decided she did not want. "She is entirely you," Emma countered. "She's made a decision and nothing will change it. That's you. The expression on her face is exactly your expression when you've concluded something is wrong and intend to remain concluded about it forever." Monroe looked at Clara Ruth, who returned his gaze with gray eyes and a set jaw, and then looked back at Emma. "She's us," he said. "Yes," Emma agreed. "She's us." They added a room to the house in 1886, and another in 1888 when a third child was expected, a boy they named William Will, for Clara Fontaine's son who had gone back for his notebook at the creek bank, and who had grown into a fine 17-year-old who was being apprenticed to Sam Dalton at the North Ranch, and who had the grace to be somewhat embarrassed when reminded of the flash flood, which Emma found endearing. Will Townsend arrived in November 1888 with the immediate and committed cheerfulness that would define his character through every subsequent phase of his life, laughing at things from practically his first conscious weeks in a way that made everyone in the household feel, consistently, that things were basically going to be fine. The winter of 1888 was a settled, full one. The house was large enough now for everyone, and the warmth of it, literal and otherwise, was the kind that had been built one small choice at a time, one honest conversation, one reached-out hand in a community hall with the fiddle playing and the lanterns warm and the whole town holding its breath. Emma sat on the porch on an evening in December with James on one side, now 4 years old and serious about everything, and Monroe beside her with Clara Ruth on his lap, and Will sleeping inside in the new room's cradle. And the stars were out in their Arizona multitudes, the sky clear and vast and brilliant. And she thought about a woman on a train with 2 carpet bags and a story she barely believed. And she thought about arriving somewhere and discovering that the place you thought was a hiding spot was actually just home. "What are you thinking about?" Monroe asked. "The train," she said, "coming here." He was quiet for a moment. "Were you frightened?" "Terrified," she said. "I was absolutely certain I was making another mistake. I had a very thorough list of reasons it could go wrong. And I was wrong about all of them," she said. "I was wrong about all the things I was afraid of." James, who had been listening with the focused attention of a 4-year-old who believes adult conversations are primarily educational, said, "What were you afraid of?" Emma looked at her son, with his dark hair and his thoughtful face, and thought about how to answer that honestly. "I was afraid of letting people know me," she said. "I thought that if people knew who I really was, they might not want me." "That's silly," James said, with the magnificent certainty of a child who has never had reason to doubt his own welcome. "You're right," Emma said. "It was silly." "Everybody wants you," James said. "Everybody in town. Mrs. Fontaine cries whenever she talks about you." Monroe made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She does do that," Emma admitted. James seemed satisfied with this confirmation, and returned to the stick he had been using to trace patterns in the porch dust. And Emma and Monroe sat together in the December dark with their children around them, and the stars overhead and Dusty Creek quiet and safe below. And the past was not gone. It was all still there. Gerald Calloway's dark ledger and the train ticket and the flash flood and the social and the fifth dance. But it was all resolved and complete, and it had led here. Undeniably and without any credible alternative, here to this porch and this evening and this life that was wholly, entirely, unguardedly her own. In the spring of 1889, Emma received word from the U.S. Marshal's office that Gerald Calloway had been convicted and sentenced, and that the full scope of his activities had been documented and prosecuted, and that the case was closed. She filed the letter in the small tin box with the notes from Monroe's courtship and the letter from Absalom Tate and the program from their wedding, which Clara had saved and pressed flat and given her as a gift. She wrote to Absalom Tate with the news. He wrote back within 2 weeks, a longer letter now, more practiced, full of news about Crawford County and his family and his farm, and she wrote back, and they maintained this correspondence for years. A thread of honest communication between 2 people who had both lost something significant to the same man's dark choices, and had both, in their different ways and different places, found their way through to something real. The Dusty Creek Spring Social of 1889 was attended by a community that had grown in the 6 years since Emma's first arrival: new families, new businesses, a second school building that had been Emma's particular project, a town newspaper that had launched the previous year. The hall was more crowded than it had ever been, and Pete Dorsey had recruited a second fiddle player and a banjo to keep up with the demand. Emma danced with Monroe as the evening opened, as she had every year since their first social together, and when they took the floor, several people around the room smiled with the particular warm recognition of people watching something they have been watching for a long time and fully expect to keep watching for a long time more. Clara Fontaine, who was Emma's right hand at every community event, and who was possibly the most reliably sentimental person in 3 counties, dabbed at her eyes approximately 4 minutes into the first dance, which caused her husband to hand her his handkerchief with the resigned patience of a man who has been doing this for years. "Every time," he said. "Every time," she confirmed unapologetically. Monroe danced with Emma until the fiddle switched to something real paced, and then they stood at the side together, breathless and laughing, with James nearby being supervised by Ruth Dalton while he consumed an alarming quantity of the community cake, and Clara Ruth attempted to instruct several older children in a game of her own, devising with rules she was clearly improvising as she went. "Remember the first time?" Monroe said. "Which time?" Emma asked, though she knew perfectly well. "The first social. You looked at me after the fourth dance and said every other man had only danced with you once." "I remember," she said. "I was trying to figure out your motive." "And your motive was completely transparent," she said. "I was just scared enough to require an explanation before I could let myself understand it." "You're not scared anymore?" he asked. His voice was quiet and genuine, not pressing, just asking. Emma Hawkins Townsend looked at her husband in the warm lantern light of the Dusty Creek Community Hall with their children nearby and their community around them, and 6 years of a life built honestly and completely between them. And she said, with the same direct, clear certainty she had always valued above all else, "No, not anymore." He smiled, the smile she knew as well as her own face by now, the one that started in his eyes and arrived at his mouth a half-second later, warm and real and specifically for her. "Good," he said. And it was. It was, by any honest accounting, profoundly, completely, unreservedly good. The years continued, and the children grew, and the town grew with them. And Monroe was sworn in for a third term as marshal in 1890 and a fourth in 1893. And the territory made its long, complicated progress toward statehood, and Dusty Creek grew from 340 souls to over 700. And Emma's school expanded, and she trained 2 younger teachers, and eventually became the territory's informal advocate for rural education funding, traveling to Tucson twice a year to make her case before the territorial legislature, with the focused, unhurried, thoroughly prepared competence that had always been her particular gift. James grew into a young man with his mother's analytical mind and his father's patience, and eventually studied law in Tucson. Clara Ruth grew into a woman who was both more stubborn and more generous than anyone had quite predicted, and who at 22 married a civil engineer from the rail company in the most organized, efficiently planned wedding Dusty Creek had ever seen, because she was, ultimately, Emma Hawkins Townsend's daughter. Will grew into exactly the cheerful, good-natured, practically competent person his early temperament had promised, and took a position as a deputy under his father at 21, which made Monroe quietly, visibly proud in a way he tried to manage but could not entirely contain. Emma and Monroe sat on the porch every evening that the weather allowed. They walked the creek path. They went out to the flat rock above town, not as often as they had in the beginning but still sometimes, when they needed to think or simply to be in the place where they had first been honest with each other about what they were to each other. The rock was still there. The stars were still there. The red country spread itself south and west in the long evening light as generously as ever. "Do you ever regret it?" Monroe asked her once on a September evening in 1892, with the light going gold and the air beginning to cool and the creek audible below them. "Coming here, staying," Emma considered, which was her way when questions deserved consideration. "Not a single day," she said, "not a moment. Even Gerald Calloway, the ledger, the train. Especially that," she said. "Without that I wouldn't have been on the train. Without the train I wouldn't have been in the general store on that Tuesday morning. Without that Tuesday morning. You would have formed an incomplete opinion because you'd mainly slept," he finished. She laughed. "Yes," she said, "and you would never have had your opening." "I would have found another opening," he said. "Probably," she allowed, "but I like the one we had." He reached over and covered her hand with his, the way he had done 10,000 times, and she turned her hand and laced her fingers through his, the way she had done 10,000 times back, and they sat together on the flat rock, while the Arizona light made its extraordinary nightly performance across the red country, and Dusty Creek was below them, real and present and full of everything they had built. And the evening was warm, and the stars were coming, and there was absolutely nothing more that needed to be resolved or said or fixed or understood. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to be. Everything had led here, exactly and inevitably here, to this evening and this hand and this man and this life that had started with a train ticket and a false story and a careful, frightened woman who had been brave enough, in a community hall with fiddle music and paper flowers, to take a hand that was offered honestly and see where it led. It had led here. It had led home. It had led, as the best things always do, to the truest possible version of herself, standing in the full light of a life she had not known was possible until the moment she stopped running and started, finally and completely, to arrive. The stars came out. The creek ran below. Monroe Townsend, Marshal of Dusty Creek, kept his hand in Emma Hawkins Townsend's, and the Red Rock country held them both in the ancient, indifferent, ultimately generous way of places that have been standing long enough to know that the lives played out against them matter, that every small act of courage matters, that arriving somewhere and choosing to stay is not a small thing but is, in fact, the whole thing. And they stayed. They stayed for all of it.